The views and opinions expressed in the following program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of KSMQ Public Service Media Incorporated or its assigns.
This week, we're taking the gardening experience to the next step. What plants are the right ones for you? We're taking your calls and questions. You're watching Garden Connections. Stay with us. Welcome to Garden Connections. I'm Amy Whitaker. Thank you for joining us. I'm happy to introduce Vicki Tremble and Tom Theesfeld, who are here to talk with us about what may work best for you. We welcome your participation in preparing for spring planting. Call in and pose your question. The number is there at the bottom of your screen. So, Tom and Vicki, how's it going tonight?
Good.
A little wet.
A little wet.
It's a little rainy.
We need that.
Yeah, we do.
So I know we've kind of touched on soils and general preparation of your garden and a lot on like vegetables and fruits. Tonight we're going to kind of start moving into the more flowers, trees, shrubs, that kind of stuff. And I know we've touched on zone before, climate zone, and I was just wondering if we could go back and touch on that again and give us your opinion on, you know, what zone we are, or the facts of what zone we are.
Sure. Well, I think it's real important with the tree, shrubs, the perennial stuff that you want to have for a long time. You know, you're planting this stuff so you don't have to plant it every year. So if you look at it, it's very important to look at the zone. Where we're at here is zone 4. People oftentimes try to push the zone 5, and it works. You know, you might get something to grow for a couple years, then we get a bad winter and it doesn't come back. And you know, a lot of the stuff isn't real cheap. When you're buying the trees and shrubs, it's more expensive than buying a little flower. So you want something that's going to last, and it's work, getting everything established. So I think it's real important to avoid that disappointment of getting something that you think is going to last 30 years and instead only last 3.
Exactly.
So.
You have to buy the plant that's going to grow here, and you're going to have it for a couple of years when you buy the Zone 5 that you can buy at big box stores and things like that. But they're only going to last a couple of years.
Okay, so if somebody is set on trying one of those Zone 5 plants, what kind of tips can you give them to help maybe make them survive through a harsh winter?
I would think the biggest thing would be to make sure it's protected. Somehow it's got to be protected from the winter wind. You know, that wind is so cold and so harsh. You know, we often talk about wind chill and stuff, and it's that wind that can just...
And you can get into the microclimates. That's when we were talking about microclimates, so where you can put it into a protected corner of the house or closer to the house, and that'll help immensely.
A little warmer in this certain areas, maybe gets a little more sun.
Right.
Sometimes things with concrete around them, the concrete holds the heat in more.
The
so that area
foundation
tends
of your
to be
home.
warmer. Yeah.
Yeah.
So those tend to be warmer, so you at least have a better chance of surviving for a longer period of time if you do something like that. If you're out in the farm and you throw it out in the middle of nothing, try to build a windbreak out of Zone 5, you're just going to be replanting.
All right, so now that we've established what plants we can grow as far as our climate, what would be the difference between an annual and a perennial plant?
Oh, go ahead.
Well, annual plant is exactly that. You have it for 1 year and that's it. And then the perennial is something that's going to come back year after year. There's kind of a little saying about perennials. There's the first year they sleep, the second year they creep, the third year they leap. So the third year is when they're actually going to look really, really nice. The first couple of years, they kind of stay little. And then there's also the biannuals, where the first year it's the green that grows, and the second year you're going to get the bloom.
The nice thing, too, it's nice to mix the two.
Right.
If you have annuals, they usually flower all summer long.
Yeah.
That's what they're there. They're there for color. So you can kind of mix those in
Yeah.
while your perennials are getting established,
Exactly.
or whatever. Sometimes you want to, if you want to change it up a little bit each year, you know, you throw annuals in there. Again, maybe around
It
perennials.
gives you more
whatever.
color.
Yeah.
You know, because your perennials only bloom at a certain time of the year. Hopefully you plant for early spring, middle summer, fall. But in between there, if you put your annuals in, you got all that color.
Different color, and yeah, and if you're not sure you're going to like it, you know, the annuals are usually less expensive.
Right.
So you try something, you say, oh, I kind of like having red or there or whatever, so then maybe you try to find a perennial that fits in that area.
And height, if you're trying to figure out what height you want to put in somewhere, you can put in a taller annual one year. If you like the height of it, you can go out and buy your perennial to put it in there.
Sure, and you can, you know, perennials you can transplant too if you
Yeah.
need to. If you did it wrong, if you got something you didn't like, you can transplant.
Most
You know.
gardeners are constantly digging things
Moving
up and
around.
moving them.
Didn't think your yard was mobile, but it can be.
Yeah, they definitely are.
Well, how about when it comes to like the care for your perennials, fertilizing, dividing, trimming, that kind of stuff? What would you say would be a general breakdown through the season of how you would care for your perennial?
Well, in the beginning of the year, you want to do your fertilizing. It also depends on which perennial you're talking about, too, as to what kind of care you're going to do with it. But there's certain ones that are going to bloom earlier in the year. They're going to come up faster. They're going to bloom. And when they're done, a lot of them you cut back right away. Some of them you leave the green up. They're all a little bit different depending on what it is.
It can be, well, I actually brought a lilac shrub here, and the thing that's a little different about lilacs, a lot of shrubs you'll actually cut back like first thing in the spring before they really start to grow, before they get the year's growth. The lilac, though, when it's done blooming, because it blooms early spring, and then you want to prune it back then because it's going to start to grow for next year, and then next year it's going to bloom off of the growth from the year. So you don't want to, if you cut that back in early spring, then you're not going to have any flowers.
And it's like that with clematis. Clematises, there's some of them that bloom in early spring. You don't want to cut them back. There's some that bloom in the summer on their new growth. They're all a little bit different.
Yeah, so it's important when you go to your garden center, when you
Right.
purchase something, they should know all that information, and they can give you the information right
Or
off the
hopefully they come
top
with
of
a
the
tag.
Yeah, there's some tags like this that has some general information, including zone, is on there, and also the expected height that it could get and width. Sometimes people are a little surprised they see these little shrubs. Again, the lilac there is called a dwarf, but it can get 6 feet high and 6 or 7 feet wide. So if you're expecting a dwarf to be 2 feet or 3 feet tall and about that wide, that's not what you want. And it's hard to prune things. You know, everything's kind of got its natural shape that it wants to be, and sometimes you can prune it to fit a certain area, but generally the plants do better if they're allowed to take their natural form.
Right.
And then rather than you trying to make them what you want them to be, it's better if you buy the plant that's going to fit the area better.
And what about like deadheading? I hear a lot about deadheading, not only like your perennials, but your trees and shrubs to elongate the bloom season. Is that a pretty good rule of thumb? Does that work pretty well for most plants?
Everything should be deadheaded. Your annuals, the more you deadhead, the more flowers you're going to get, especially like zinnias. You deadhead zinnias and they just keep coming and coming and coming. But as soon as you leave those heads on there, that's what their seed pods come from. And they think they've lived their life, so you deadhead them to keep them from dying back.
And it's usually, you know, dead things aren't really that healthy for plants. I mean, plants are more healthy when you get rid of them. Even, again, like on the shrubs, sometimes you'll get a dead branch or a tree, there'll just be a dead part of it. You know, get rid of it, get it out of there, because it's of no benefit to the plant to have. It's just, like she's saying, it's actually keeping it from doing what it wants to do, so
Right.
producing more and getting thicker and fuller.
Okay, and when it comes to trees and shrubs, what's the biggest difference between them? How they're shaped or how they grow?
Well, generally, a tree is something on a stick, so to speak, and sometimes you can kind of shape them a little bit so they're more shrub-like or more tree-like. But basically, a tree's got a stick coming out of it, and a shrub will have multiple sticks coming out of the bottom. Yeah. The thing they're doing now that's kind of cool is a lot of these things you can get on a stick. That were shrub things like lilacs, like burning bush. You can get them on a stick now. It's in a tree form. But sometimes they just call them. We call it hydrangea on a stick or something, just for
topiaries.
For fun. Yeah.
Topiary is another word for that.
So that's kind of an interesting thing. If you would prefer something that's a little more tree-like, but you like the shrub type things with the flowers or with the different color that they bring, you can actually get it on a stick.
And I suppose that would work for controlling size a little bit too. If somebody likes the lilac trees but doesn't have room for a 25-foot tree,
exactly.
Sure, right.
But it's a lot more trimming. They have to realize if they're going to get something like that, they got to do a lot of trimming to keep it that way.
Sure.
Alrighty. So when choosing our plants, we can go with native, non-native. What's your guys' take on that?
Native, they're a lot healthier around here. They're a lot less care, but it's a natural thing for them to spread whatever. Where you're non-native is stuff that's come from somewhere else, a little bit more care. You got to be a little bit more careful as to where you plant it. Watch your zones and things like that.
Yeah, and sometimes we see, things just naturally spread, like she was saying,
Right.
in the wilderness or in the wild or whatever you want to call it, in ditches, stuff like that. People see stuff and say, boy, I want that. And it may not necessarily be that you can go and buy that exact plant.
Right.
That's moved in, over however many years that it's acclimated itself to the Minnesota climate, just like the rest of us. It takes, about 90 years to get used to this weather? The winters and stuff.
Well, some of that native stuff is considered weeds. It's like one person's weed is another person's flower. So it all depends on what you consider your native flowers.
And something like you're saying too, we've heard of some people actually going to like ditches and digging something up, and they plant it. They got this nice little flower box. We're going to plant it there, and then all of a sudden it's growing over there and over there, and it's like it's very hard to control sometimes. And that's why they just grow in the wild. You don't have to control them out there.
We have a question from a caller. Somebody wants to know about how to prune their lilac bushes that are overgrown and unruly. They want to clean them up.
Tree man.
Well, the biggest kind of rule of thumb about trimming any tree or shrub is don't take any more than a third of it at a time. You want to, you don't want to. Anytime you're trimming anything like that, you are causing damage, and you're opening wounds. So you want to make sure that you don't do too much too fast. So if it's real overgrown, you may have to do a little this year, a little next year, but make sure you prune it after it's done blooming, assuming that it's blooming, but I would bet that it is, so you don't lose the flowers for next year. And then you just have to wait till that next year and then do it again. And then you can eventually get it shaped in, and you'll have the nice blooms the whole time. The other thing that's important too is to make sure you use a sharp, whatever tool you use, make sure it's sharp, because you can tear. It's like cutting that loaf of bread with a dull knife, and you flatten it. You don't want to tear at the tree. You want a nice sharp cut, just to minimize that wound again. That's the other important thing about doing it at the right time. Also, some people like to prune stuff right before winter, and then it gives that wound. It may not have enough time to heal that wound right before it has to deal with the harshness of winter. So, get in the right time to do things. But the lilac, certainly, right after it's done blooming, you have only like a 2 or 3 week period before it starts getting the new growth that's going to bloom off of next year.
How about thinning them out, like as far as if you've got all kinds of old gnarly wood down in there and then some nice new sprouts coming out?
Yeah, again, anything that's dead, just get rid of because it's useless. But even thinning it out, it's a little harder to tell, but again, don't take more than a third of it out when you're thinning it. And that is a good idea, definitely, to thin it, get rid of the bad stuff so the good stuff can come through stronger. And I think a lot of times people don't think of that. When they think of pruning, they think of, knocking off the top. But it's definitely important to go through and get that less desirable branches in there. Get rid of the weak links so the stronger stuff can come through.
I hear a lot of talk about invasive plants. What exactly is an invasive plant?
It's a plant that's going to take over. There's a lot of plants out there, like ground covers and things like that, that'll come in, and you think you're going to plant it, and it's just going to cover over here, and it's like, no, they will come in and they will invade, is more or less what they do.
And they compete with what you want to grow. They're
They can smother things out.
Yeah. And that, again, is important to know what you're planting, to make sure that this goes with this. Otherwise, you may end up, like you say, with more of this and none of this, eventually choking it out.
What are good ways if you are going to plant something that might spread, whether it's via seed or just by crawling across the ground? What are some good ways to maybe contain those types of things?
Oh, that's kind of a tough one. It depends on, yeah, what it is. And like there's a gooseneck loosestrife that really can take over, and it all comes up from the roots. So I have heard of people who have actually planted pots in the ground that they stay within that pot. It's an awful lot of work to plant that in the ground, but it's probably a lot less work than trying to get it out of there when it's taking over.
Yeah, it has to be something, because some spread by seed, like you're saying, and then that's really hard because they can, it just blows all over.
Right.
And then
But
some
the
spread
ones
by
that
the
come
roots.
up by the root
Yeah.
systems, they can really invade.
Yeah, and so people plant them in nice little, make nice little planters or
Right.
whatever, and they just go right underneath and come up somewhere else.
Yeah. So you got to make sure it's got a bottom on it and everything to keep
Yeah.
it from doing that.
Alrighty. So, when it comes to like your perennial garden, what types of things do you want to keep in mind when you're designing the garden? Like,
First thing you're going to want to check out is your sun. How much sun you have, where the sun goes, what time of day, and things like that. The condition of the soil. You're going to want to find out if it's a dry area, a wet area. If you want your height in the center, off to the side, you're going to want your small plants in the front, and your tall plants either in the middle or in the back of depending on what it faces. If you want trees, shrubs in it, and things like that, they're sort of like the bones of your perennial beds sometimes.
Sure, and sometimes what is it going to turn into?
Right.
Sometimes people will plant a small young tree, and then they'll plant a bunch of perennials around it that like sun.
Sun.
And then 5-10 years from now, it's shade, and now my plants aren't doing so good.
Right.
So if you're willing to do that and then dig them up and put something else there, that's fine. But you should at least be aware that the climate in that area may change depending on what you're growing.
And a lot of people think when you plant a perennial, it's in there, you don't have to take care of it. But it's like eventually they get overgrown, they need to be split. You have to dig them up, split them. It helps them to rejuvenate and grow again. Like daylilies. Eventually they need to be dug up and split, and it's a lot of work. Hostas.
Sure.
A lot of people love hostas. They plant them all over the place, and then they get huge, and they have to dig them up, and it's a lot of work.
So know that it takes work. The other thing I think
does.
people don't always think of is these things, especially the first few years, take a lot of water.
Yes.
And it's important, even now, we get rain fairly frequently now, but you're going to have to watch them. And you definitely want to water them slowly so that water goes in. You want the water to go all the way down to the roots so that the roots will go down for water so that when we get dry period, they'll last a little longer. And then in the dry, it's really important to water.
And going back to your deadheading, that's the other thing with perennials. You have to deadhead them so that all that nutrient goes back into the plant so that they can produce for next year.
and we have a question. What are some good plants for growing in our area, tree and shrub-wise, or even perennials? What are maybe some of your favorites for sun, some of your favorites for shade? Tom?
One of my favorites, and maybe you can tell, is I really like lilac shrubs. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason is you just walk out and you just smell that, just that fragrance.
It's the beginning of spring.
Yeah, and they
It
just
really
get
is.
so full. Mm-hmm. That you look at it. We've got one in our yard. We've got one nice one, and then I just have 4 young ones. So I'm waiting for them to get bigger. But you're just like in awe, and like I said, you're like, okay, now we're ready to get to it.
That's right. Yeah.
As far as trees too, I also kind of enjoy. Of course, I like a little color, but I have like a flowering crab tree. It's just so it doesn't seem to last very long in the spring, but you just look out and you see all those, whatever color flowers
a lot
around
of the flowering crab now, you don't get the crab apples
Right.
anymore. So you
Yeah,
don't
you get them
have the
without
mess
the-
of that. You can have that beautiful blooming tree, and you don't have the mess of the crab apples.
I even really like tulips are one of my favorite things too.
Yes.
And maybe I like everything that's early in the spring. I don't know, but they just when you get things in clusters, it just seems like they look really
Tulips
nice.
have a tendency to wear themselves out, though. But if you put in daffodils, that's another one
Sure.
that's good, and the clumps get bigger and bigger and bigger. They have a tendency more to spread than your tulips do.
The other thing that's fun in talking about that is putting different things, whether it's bulbs or
Yes.
plants. This is done blooming, and then something else blooms right in the same area.
Exactly.
So you don't feel like you've got this zoning in your yard where nothing, you know,
Right.
I don't want to go in here.
You
and,
have to look at that when you're setting up your perennial bed. Yep.
is what it's going to look like through the
spring,
year.
summer, and fall.
So lilacs, any other shrubs or trees?
You know, for fall, you know, I really like a burning bush with that nice bright red color. Of course, that's something that's real important to get in the sun. So it gets that sun all summer long, so it gets that nice bright color in the fall.
And there are a lot of new hydrangeas that are getting to the point where we can have them in this area.
Yeah.
We never had hydrangeas much before, but
They
there's a
got
lot
that
of new hydrangeas.
nice flower. Another thing I think of is like a nice red twig dogwood, something like that.
Yes.
In the wintertime, you know, the leaves are all gone. We got this nice red stem in the snow,
Right.
and it just looks, you know, it's got a nice look to it. So I don't know, they're all good.
They're all good, yeah. Anything zone 4 is good.
They, you know, a smoke bush looks really good too. I like to see a smoke bush in
are
this.
very pretty. I'm not too impressed with their bloom,
Yeah.
but I do love the leaves on them.
We have another caller question. Somebody would like to know if we can plant like cucumber and squash next to each other, or if we're going to end up with strange.
Well, that's a
looking
question from
fruit.
last week.
I think so.
Yeah, that's not a good idea. Yeah.
It's not good.
There's a gal at work, and she's probably the one that called just to try to get me going. Oh, and I can't remember if it was her or a relative of her did it, and you get, you know, oddball looking, you know, you get a
Fruit.
fruit, a weird looking cucumber that tastes like cantaloupe or squash or whatever.
Really?
And it can happen, but you don't need, it's not like you have to space them, you know, 2 yards apart. You just put something in the middle just to try to keep that cross-pollinating, or you can try to get different maturities. Maybe get something that's, you know, you get an earlier cucumber and a later squash so they don't pollinate at the same time. But anyway.
There we go.
I don't know if you have trouble with that with flowers. I don't think there's any flowers that
Not
do that.
too much, no.
Although it's kind of fun. If you do it with the flower, you created a new thing.
Yeah.
And then you
There you go.
then you can name it.
Yeah.
Start cross-pollinating and putting out your seedlings and see
Yes.
what happens.
And that only takes about 10 years to come to fruit.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I hear it's more like a lifetime
Yeah,
for trees
exactly.
too to
Yes.
find a new tree. Okay, how about some of your favorite perennials for our area?
Perennials, well, hosta is always a favorite perennial for a lot of people. And I do like things like sedum. I like sedum a lot. It's really pretty in the springtime, and then in the fall it's got this really pretty bloom on it. And I don't know, there's just so much of them that I really like. Hardy geraniums are really great. And not the pelargonium, yes, but the hardy geraniums are really nice. And there's hundreds of different kinds of geranium plants out there that come up every year.
Another one that's kind of fun to think of is a bleeding heart.
Bleeding
in the
hearts.
springtime, you know, that's
another
so
springtime
unique.
one,
Yeah.
And there's a lot of new daylilies out there. You know, it's not the old yellow or orange ditch ones anymore. There's so many different colors and sizes of daylilies that you can get.
We have another caller question. What is the best practice for pruning crabapple trees?
That's a good question. Well, you know, we talked a little bit earlier about a flowering crab, non-crabapple thing. So it depends a little if it has apples, doesn't have apples, if it's a flowering tree or just a fruit-bearing tree. You know, fruit trees are a little different. You got to be careful.
What time of year you do it and things like that?
Yeah, you got to be a little careful what time of the year you do it. Make sure you do it, and it may even depend from one. You know, apple trees are a little different than like apricot trees or stuff like that. But you can. The rule of thumb, I think most of them you'd want to do again before they start to grow in the spring. But you don't want to cut that new growth off because obviously they're going to start to grow and form, you know, their flowers and their buds and stuff like that, and then that's how they produce the fruit. So you want to make sure you don't cut them off when they're trying to push things out.
Okay, we had a question regarding wisteria. Oh, how do we move wisteria from place to place? Like if we've had one established in an area, what would be the best way to get it moved to a new area?
That would depend on how old it is and how big of a root ball it has. Wisteria is a little bit fussier, so they're a little bit harder to move. Once they get established in a place, which a lot of times is very difficult to get a wisteria established in this part of the country. So if it's happy where it's at, I'd really hate to move it. But if you're going to move it, take as big a root ball as you can out of there. Cut a really big, because you don't want to cut any of the root system if you at all can. And you're going to have to cut it off of its trellis or whatever you have it growing on. I don't know if this would be the best time of year to do that, or if it'd be better to do it in the fall when it's done and going dormant. That might be a better time to do it.
Can wisteria be layered? I know with raspberries you can like take a cane, put it down into the dirt, and it'll root, and then you have a whole new plant. Is that something that can be done with wisteria, so you can maybe try growing a few new plants instead of trying to move your one big old one?
It's probably possible, but the one thing with wisteria is there's only a female will bloom. So that's the other thing with wisteria. If you have a male, it will never bloom, ever. And you won't know that for about 5 years, because sometimes it'll take 5 years for a female to bloom. So it depends, you know. Do you want a wisteria that's not blooming? Are you moving it because it's not blooming? That might not be the reason. It might be because it's a male.
And I think it's important, just in general, not to. It's harder on things when you move them when they're blooming, and in the summer when it's real hot.
Oh, real hot.
Because you really put them under stress. It's best if you move them when they're not blooming and when it's cool. But not in December.
Not in December or July.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. Went by fast as usual, and I would like to thank everybody to check out our blog on ksmq.org, ksmq.org. We are taking additional questions and comments on the blog site, so feel free to register and leave us any ideas you may have. And again, thank you for joining us. Now your garden is on its way. Tune in next week when we'll talk about more tips and what's on your mind and in your garden. For everyone at Garden Connections, I'm Amy Whitaker. See you next week.